My sister texted demanding I co-sign her car loan. When I refused, Dad threatened, "Refuse, and you're cut off from family events." I called the bank immediately and canceled their credit line. The moment I hung up with the bank representative, something shifted inside me. Not anger exactly, but a cold, calculating clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't going to be manipulated by my family's emotional blackmail. I sat back in my home office chair, staring at the confirmation email that had just arrived. Credit line terminated, effective immediately. My sister Hannah's text had been typical of her entitled approach to life. "I need a new car. You'll co-sign." Not a request, a demand. No pleasantries, no explanation of what happened to the perfectly functional Toyota Camry I'd already given her 2 years ago, when she was between jobs for the 4th time. Just an expectation that I'd financially obligate myself for whatever luxury vehicle she'd decided she deserved this time. What really struck me was the calculated nature of it all. She'd sent that text knowing I'd refuse, knowing it would trigger Dad's ultimatum. This wasn't desperation, it was manipulation with multiple layers, and I was done being their financial safety net. I'm Marcus, 34, and I run a successful logistics consulting firm that I built from nothing over the past 8 years. I specialize in supply chain optimization for mid-sized manufacturing companies, which means I'm very good at analyzing systems, identifying weak points, and implementing strategic solutions. My clients pay me exceptionally well because I can see patterns others miss, and I always think 3 moves ahead. Those skills were about to become very relevant to my family's situation. My financial position gives me options most people don't have. I own my house outright in a nice suburb, no mortgage. I drive a paid-off truck that's practical rather than flashy. My business generates consistent 6-figure revenue, and I've been disciplined about saving and investing since my early 20s. I have 0 debt, excellent credit, and enough liquid assets to weather any storm. More importantly, I'm not financially dependent on anyone in my family, which puts me in a position of strength they've never had to deal with before. Hannah, on the other hand, is 30 and has never held a job for more than 18 months. She lives rent-free in my parents' basement, burns through money on luxury items she can't afford, and has a credit score somewhere in the basement thanks to defaulted store cards and unpaid bills. She's loud, dramatic, and has spent 3 decades perfecting the art of playing victim whenever consequences come calling. My parents enable every bit of it because it's easier than setting boundaries. The credit line I just canceled was something they'd pressured me into opening 3 years ago during a family crisis. Dad had been diagnosed with diabetes and needed some expensive treatments. Mom was working part-time and stressed about money. They made it sound temporary, just a safety net for medical expenses. What it actually became was Hannah's personal shopping fund. In 18 months, she'd maxed out the $15,000 limit on everything except medical bills. Designer clothes, expensive dinners, a weekend trip to Miami with friends, and yes, that Camry I mentioned, which she'd insisted on upgrading with premium sound system and custom wheels. I had documentation of every purchase, bank statements, receipts, text message conversations where she'd asked permission for just this one thing, and then spent 3 times what she'd requested. I'm methodical about record keeping, a habit from my business that was about to prove invaluable. The morning after I canceled the credit line, my phone exploded. 37 missed calls by 9 a.m. Hannah, Mom, Dad, even my Aunt Linda, who I hadn't spoken to in months. I let them all go to voicemail while I had my morning coffee and planned my next moves. Hannah's voicemail was predictably hysterical. "You just screwed over the entire family. Mom needs that credit line for her medications. You're being selfish and cruel." Classic Hannah, making herself the victim while throwing Mom under the bus for sympathy. Except, I knew Mom's medications were covered by insurance, and the credit line had never been used for anything medical. Dad's message was shorter and angrier. "Call me back immediately. We need to discuss your attitude problem." Mom's was guilt-heavy manipulation about family loyalty and how disappointed she was in my behavior. But it was Jake's message that gave me the most useful information. Jake is my cousin, one of the few family members with any sense. "Dude, Hannah's been telling everyone you cut off her car fund out of spite. She's claiming you promised to co-sign and then backed out to punish her for some imaginary slight. Just thought you should know what story she's spreading. This told me several important things. First, Hannah was already reframing the narrative to make herself look like the victim of my unreasonable behavior. Second, she was lying about promises I'd never made. Third, she was building sympathy among family members who didn't have the full context. It was a strategic misinformation campaign, and it confirmed that this was about much more than just a car loan. I spent the rest of that morning making some strategic phone calls. First, I called my attorney, David, who handles both business and personal legal matters. I explained the situation and asked about my liability exposure with the canceled credit line and the Camry situation. The credit line is straightforward, David told me. You were an authorized user with full termination rights. They can't force you to maintain it. As for the car, if the title is still in your name and you've been paying insurance, it's legally your property regardless of who's been driving it. This was crucial information. I'd never actually transferred the Camry's title to Hannah. I'd meant to, but she'd never gotten insurance sorted out, so I'd kept paying for everything and told myself I'd transfer it later. Her procrastination had just become my legal advantage. My recommendation, David continued, is to document everything. Keep records of all financial transactions, save all text messages and voicemails. If this escalates, you'll want evidence of their demands and your reasonable responses. Next, I called my financial advisor, Gary, to discuss the broader implications. The credit line closure will improve your debt-to-income ratio, he confirmed. You were carrying potential liability for their spending, even though you weren't using it. From a financial planning perspective, this was smart. You've eliminated risk without losing any actual assets. Finally, I called my business mentor, Tom, who's been through his own family financial drama. The mistake most people make, he told me, is fighting emotional battles with emotional weapons. You're a strategist. Use data, documentation, and logical consequences. Don't get pulled into their drama, but don't back down from reasonable boundaries. By noon, I had a clear action plan. I wasn't going to engage in emotional arguments or family drama. I was going to treat this like a business problem and implement systematic solutions. Step 1 was retrieving my property. The Camry was parked in my parents' driveway when I arrived with a tow truck that afternoon. I'd called ahead to a reputable towing company, explained that I needed to retrieve my own vehicle, and arranged for transport to a secure storage facility I'd rented specifically for this purpose. The tow truck driver examined the title and insurance documents I'd brought and confirmed everything was in order. Hannah came running out of the house screaming the moment she saw the truck backing into the driveway. "You can't take my car! I need it for work!" This was particularly interesting since she'd been unemployed for 6 weeks, something I knew from Mom's previous phone calls asking if I had any job leads for Hannah. "It's not your car," I replied calmly. "The title is in my name, I pay the insurance, and I've been covering all maintenance. You've been borrowing it." "But you gave it to me? You said I could have it." "I said you could use it temporarily while you got back on your feet. That was 2 years ago. Your feet seem to be firmly planted in Mom and Dad's basement." The tow truck driver was professional and quick. Within 20 minutes, the Camry was loaded and gone. Hannah alternated between tears and screaming. Mom came out and tried to negotiate, asking if we could work something out. Dad stayed inside, but I could see him watching from the window. "The car will be in secure storage," I told Mom. "When Hannah gets a job, saves up for a down payment on her own vehicle, and demonstrates some financial responsibility, we can discuss her buying this one from me at fair market value." That evening, Jake texted me with an update. "The family group chat is losing its collective mind. Hannah's claiming you stole her car and canceled Mom's medical credit line. Dad's talking about legal action. Mom's trying to play peacemaker. It's actually pretty entertaining." I screenshot Jake's message and forwarded it to David, my attorney. Within an hour, he'd sent me a cease and desist template to use if anyone made serious legal threats. The next few days were quiet. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. In my experience, this usually meant they were regrouping and planning their next approach. I used the time to gather more documentation and prepare for whatever was coming. I pulled 3 years of bank statements showing every transaction on the canceled credit line. I organized receipts and purchase confirmations for all the items Hannah had bought. I compiled text message conversations where she'd asked for money and made promises about paying me back that she'd never kept. I even found the original family meeting notes where we'd agreed the credit line was for medical emergencies only. The pattern was undeniable. In 36 months, Hannah had spent nearly $18,000 of available credit on non-essential items. She'd made exactly 0 payments toward the balance. Meanwhile, I'd been covering the minimum payments to protect my own credit score, essentially subsidizing her shopping addiction. I also researched the fair market value of the Camry. With its mileage and condition, it was worth about $12,000. Hannah had probably put 4,000 miles on it in 2 years, mostly driving to job interviews she'd never followed up on and social events. I'd paid for oil changes, tire rotations, and a brake repair she'd never mentioned. The maintenance records showed I'd invested another $2,000 keeping the vehicle roadworthy. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after I'd canceled the credit line, Mom called. "Marcus, we need to talk. This has gone far enough." "I'm listening." "Hannah made some mistakes with money, but she's family. She's trying to get her life together, and you're making it impossible." "How am I making it impossible?" "She needs reliable transportation to find work. She needs to know she has family support, not judgment and punishment." "Mom, I gave her free access to credit for 2 years. I provided a free car, free insurance, free maintenance. I never asked for payments or even gas money. How is that judgment and punishment?" "You know what I mean? The way you took the car, embarrassing her in front of the neighbors, cutting off the credit line without any warning." "Did Hannah tell you she texted me demanding I co-sign a loan for a new car? Not asking, demanding. Did she mention that Dad threatened to cut me off from family events when I declined?" Silence. "Did she explain what she'd been spending the credit line money on? Because I have 36 months of statements if you'd like to review them." "That's not the point, Marcus." "What is the point?" "The point is we're family, and family takes care of each other." "You're absolutely right. Family should take care of each other. So, when do Hannah and Dad plan to start taking care of me?" Another silence. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been the only one giving in this relationship. I've provided money, transportation, and financial safety nets. I've never asked for anything in return except basic respect. This week I got demands and threats instead. So I'm curious when the family loyalty starts flowing in both directions." The conversation ended shortly after that. Mom didn't have an answer because there wasn't one. The family dynamic had always been Marcus gives, Hannah takes, parents enable. The moment I disrupted that pattern, they didn't know how to respond. That weekend brought the next phase of their strategy. Aunt Linda called Saturday morning. "Marcus, I don't usually get involved in family business, but Hannah called me crying. She says you've been financially abusing her." "What does that mean exactly?" "Taking away her car and credit access to control her behavior." "Linda, did Hannah mention that the car title is in my name and I've been paying all the expenses? Did she explain that the credit line she's referring to has $15,000 in debt that I've been covering minimum payments on?" "Well, no, but..." "Did she tell you that her transportation crisis started when she demanded I co-sign for a luxury car loan, and that Dad threatened to exclude me from family events when I declined?" "She said there was a disagreement about a car loan, but she made it sound like you'd promised to help and then changed your mind to hurt her." "I never promised anything. I never even responded to her demand before Dad's threat came through. The entire situation went from 0 to ultimatum in about 10 minutes. I text messaged Linda the screenshot of Hannah's original demand and Dad's threat with timestamps. She called back an hour later. "I owe you an apology. Hannah definitely didn't give me the full story." "I appreciate that, but I'm curious why Hannah called you in the first place. We haven't had a family disagreement that involved extended family before. She's calling everyone, cousins, aunts, uncles, even some of your parents' neighbors. She's trying to build support for her side of the story." This was valuable intelligence. Hannah was running a full-scale influence campaign, reaching out to anyone who might put pressure on me to back down. It meant she was getting desperate, but it also meant I needed to be proactive about managing information flow. I spent Sunday afternoon making my own phone calls, Jake first, to get a complete picture of who Hannah had contacted and what stories she'd told. Then Uncle Dennis, who's always been straight with me. Then Cousin Patricia, who has a good head for family politics. The pattern was consistent. Hannah had contacted at least 8 family members with variations of the same story. I'd promised to help her with a car, then backed out maliciously. I'd stolen her transportation and destroyed her credit access. I was being controlling and financially abusive. She was just trying to get her life together, and I was sabotaging her for personal reasons no one could quite understand. But here's what Hannah hadn't accounted for. I'm well regarded in the family. I'm the nephew who helps people move, who brings thoughtful gifts to celebrations, who remembers birthdays and sends graduation cards. I'm financially stable and emotionally steady. I don't create drama or make unreasonable demands. My reputation gave me credibility that her tears couldn't overcome. More importantly, several family members had their own Hannah stories. Uncle Dennis mentioned money she'd borrowed and never returned. Cousin Patricia reminded me about the time Hannah had thrown a tantrum at a family barbecue because she felt ignored. Aunt Linda, now that she had the full context, shared that Hannah had asked her for money 6 months ago, using a story that didn't match what Mom had told her about Hannah's situation. By Monday morning, I had a clear picture of the battlefield. Hannah was trying to isolate me through a misinformation campaign, but it was backfiring because she'd overplayed her hand. Extended family members were comparing notes and realizing her stories didn't add up. Meanwhile, I had documentation to support everything I'd told them. It was time to go on offense. I drafted a detailed email that laid out the complete timeline with supporting documentation. Hannah's original demand, Dad's threat, the credit line history, the car title situation, and my reasonable response to unreasonable behavior. I attached bank statements, text message screenshots, and the vehicle title as evidence. Then I sent it to every family member Hannah had contacted, plus a few others who I knew would appreciate having the facts. The email was professional, factual, and completely devastating to Hannah's narrative. I didn't attack her personally or air irrelevant grievances. I simply presented the documented evidence and let people draw their own conclusions. The response was immediate and decisive. Jake replied within an hour. "Holy shit, dude. I knew Hannah was dramatic, but this is next-level manipulation. You're completely in the right here," Uncle Dennis called that afternoon. I had no idea it was this bad. Hannah made it sound like a simple misunderstanding. This is fraud-level deception. Cousin Patricia's response was the most useful. "I'm forwarding this to Mom and Aunt Carol. They need to see what Hannah actually did instead of what she claimed you did." By Wednesday, the family dynamics had completely shifted. Hannah's support network had evaporated once people saw the evidence. Several relatives reached out to apologize for initially believing her version of events. Others shared their own experiences with Hannah's manipulation tactics. But the most interesting development was complete radio silence from my immediate family. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. Hannah's nuclear option had failed spectacularly, and now they had to figure out their next move. I used this quiet period to implement the next phase of my strategy. I contacted the storage facility where the Camry was housed and arranged to have it evaluated by a certified appraiser. The official assessment came back at $11,800, which was within the range I'd expected. Then I drafted a formal letter offering to sell Hannah the vehicle for fair market value, with the option to finance the purchase through a payment plan that included interest. The terms were reasonable, but structured to ensure she'd have to demonstrate financial responsibility over time. She'd need to provide proof of income, maintain her own insurance, and make consistent monthly payments. I sent copies to Hannah, my parents, and my attorney. The letter was professional, generous, and completely undermined any claim that I was being vindictive. I was offering her a path to vehicle ownership that was fair to both parties. Hannah's response came not directly to me, but through Mom, who called Thursday evening. "She can't afford to buy the car from you. Then she can't afford to own a car right now. But she needs transportation to find work. The public bus system runs within 2 blocks of your house. It's the same transportation system I used when I was starting my business and couldn't afford a car payment. You know that's not realistic for her." "Why not?" "She's not used to public transportation. She wouldn't know how to navigate it. Most cities have online route planners and mobile apps that make it very simple. She could also ask Jake to show her the system, since he used it for years before buying his truck." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Mom presenting various reasons why Hannah couldn't be expected to use the same transportation options available to millions of other people. Each excuse revealed the depth of enabling that had created this situation in the first place. Friday brought the final attempt at manipulation. Dad called, using his serious voice reserved for major family pronouncements. "Marcus, this has gotten completely out of hand. You're destroying family relationships over money. I'm enforcing reasonable boundaries after being threatened and manipulated. Hannah's your sister. Sisters sometimes need help. I've been helping Hannah for years. I'm offering to continue helping her by selling her the car at a fair price with reasonable payment terms. She can't afford your price. Then she needs to increase her income or decrease her expenses. Those are the same two options everyone else has when they can't afford something they want. You're being unreasonable. Let me ask you something, Dad. When you threatened to cut me off from family events, what did you think would happen?" Silence. "Did you think I'd cave immediately and co-sign whatever loan Hannah wanted? Did you think I'd apologize for setting boundaries and go back to being the family ATM? I thought you'd remember that family comes first. Family does come first. That's why I'm offering Hannah a legitimate path to vehicle ownership, instead of just taking the car and walking away completely. That's why I'm willing to have this conversation with you, instead of hanging up. But family loyalty has to go both directions. What do you want from us?" It was the first time anyone had asked what I needed instead of demanding what they wanted. "I want acknowledgement that threatening me was inappropriate. I want Hannah to take responsibility for the debt she created instead of pretending she's the victim. I want to be treated like a family member whose boundaries matter, not a resource to be managed through emotional manipulation. And if we don't, then we continue with the current arrangement. Hannah doesn't get access to my financial resources, vehicles, or credit. You don't get to use threats to control my behavior. I continue being successful and financially stable while maintaining appropriate boundaries." The call ended without resolution, but I could tell Dad was finally starting to understand that his usual tactics weren't going to work this time. Over the following weeks, the consequences of their choices became increasingly apparent. Hannah had to take a part-time retail job because she needed bus money. The job turned into full-time after a few weeks because she actually proved competent when she couldn't afford to quit over minor inconveniences. Dad's attempt to organize family pressure against me had completely backfired. Several relatives were now questioning other aspects of Hannah's behavior they had previously overlooked. Uncle Dennis mentioned that he'd been reconsidering lending Hannah money for her business ideas after seeing how she'd handled the credit line. Mom found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to explain to friends and neighbors why Hannah was suddenly taking the bus everywhere. The explanations led to conversations about financial responsibility that Mom had been avoiding for years. Most importantly, I was sleeping better than I had in months. The constant low-level stress of waiting for the next Hannah crisis had disappeared. I wasn't monitoring my credit score for unexpected charges or wondering what financial emergency would require my intervention. 3 months later, Hannah made a surprising request through Jake. She wanted to apologize and discuss purchasing the Camry under the terms I'd offered. Apparently, taking the bus through a Michigan winter had clarified her transportation priorities significantly. The apology was genuine, though clearly motivated by self-interest. She acknowledged that demanding a co-signed loan had been presumptuous, and that the stories she'd told family members had been misleading. She didn't admit to outright lying, but she accepted responsibility for the consequences of her choices. More importantly, she'd saved enough money from her retail job to make a reasonable down payment on the Camry. We worked out a payment plan that stretched the remaining balance over 18 months, with modest interest. She arranged her own insurance and accepted responsibility for all future maintenance. Dad never explicitly apologized for his threat, but he did acknowledge that he'd handled the situation poorly. He started treating me more like an adult family member and less like a resource to be managed, which was the outcome I'd actually wanted. The final resolution came 6 months later when Hannah made her last payment on the Camry. She had held her retail job, been promoted to assistant manager, and started taking community college classes in business management. She still lived with my parents, but she was paying rent and contributing to household expenses. The credit line debt took longer to resolve, but we eventually worked out an arrangement where Hannah took over responsibility for half the balance. It wasn't the full amount she'd spent, but it was acknowledgement that she'd created the debt and needed to participate in resolving it. The broader family dynamics had permanently shifted. I was no longer seen as the family safety net, which freed me from constant financial pressure. Hannah had learned that actions have consequences, which improved her decision-making in other areas of her life. My parents had been forced to confront their enabling patterns, which benefited everyone involved. Jake summed it up perfectly. You taught everyone that you're not a bank, you're a brother. Took them a while to figure out the difference, but they got there eventually. The experience reinforced something I'd learned in business but hadn't applied to family relationships. Clear boundaries and consistent enforcement create better outcomes for everyone involved. Enabling dysfunction helps no one, even when it feels easier in the short term. A year later, Hannah bought her first new car with her own financing. She invited the whole family to see it, genuinely proud of what she'd accomplished independently. It was a modest sedan, nothing fancy, but it represented real progress toward adulthood and financial responsibility. That night, she pulled me aside at the celebratory dinner. I know I was awful during the whole car thing, she said. I want you to know that having to figure things out on my own was probably the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm proud of you for sticking with it. I almost gave up a dozen times. The bus sucked, the job was hard at first, and I was angry at everyone. But somewhere along the way, I realized that I actually liked taking care of myself. That conversation was worth every difficult moment of the previous year. My sister had discovered self-respect and competence she never would have found if I'd continued enabling her dependency. The family still has its moments of dysfunction, but the financial manipulation dynamics are permanently broken. Everyone knows I have boundaries and will enforce them consistently but fairly. More importantly, Hannah has learned she's capable of much more than anyone gave her credit for, including herself. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is refuse to participate in their dysfunction, even when it creates temporary conflict. Strategic thinking, clear documentation, and consistent boundary enforcement turned a crisis into an opportunity for everyone to grow.